broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to our monthly Dalim Tips and Tricks webinar. My name is Alex, and today I'll be discussing advanced ES workflow logic and routing. For those of you who are new to our webinar series, if you need to adjust the scaling of my display, if it's showing too large or too small for you, there is a zoom button in the upper left-hand corner of the main GoToWebinar window. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, there's a questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel where you can type any questions you might have. Typically, we do a Q&A at the end of the session after the presentation, but if there are any questions that are particularly pertinent to something I'm discussing, I may pause to address them. As mentioned, this is part of our monthly Dalim webinar series. We do a webinar the third Wednesday of each month. Typically, as soon as we know what we're going to be doing for the next month, we'll put info on our website at blanchardsystems.com/events, so be sure to keep an eye on that page. One other thing I'll mention too is we have coming up in a little over a month the US Duo, which is the yearly or the annual Dalim user conference. That will be from April 3rd to 5th in Nashville. Still not too late to sign up if you haven't already. It'll be a good chance to get to meet the Dalim developers directly, and also a chance to learn about some of the new features that'll be upcoming in ES6 and Twist 9. So hope to see you there. As mentioned, and I'm actually going to correct that link down there is wrong. I'll correct that in the video description when we put this on YouTube. But this will be focused on advanced ES workflow. This is kind of focused more on if you've come from maybe a Twist background perhaps, or you're newer to ES, you've built some simple, more linear workflows, but you're trying to figure out how to branch those into something more complex to better map some sort of process you have. We're going to focus a little on how you can split and merge different workflow branches, avoid common pitfalls like incorrectly canceled steps, work with the conditions editor, and troubleshoot issues with more complex conditions you might run into if you have a heavier duty business process you need to map out. So the biggest thing, especially if we have folks who've moved over to ES from Twist, the biggest challenge I think tends to be the ES sort of handles workflow the inverse of how Twist did. In Twist, everything was grouped into processes. You had a process that ran through a workflow, and that process had one or more files associated with it. So you might upload a PDF into Twist, and that PDF would be associated with your process as it moved through the workflow. If you chose to branch that out at different points in Twist, you could branch your workflow so that files went down two different paths. If, for example, you had to make two different deliveries, or you had one step, for example, for pre-flight and another to stash an original file. Once you forked those processes off or branched them off in some way, they were more or less independent of the original process you were dealing with. There wasn't really any requirement where they needed to be merged back in because as far as Twist was concerned, it would just follow whatever you told it to do. If it needed to split something off, there was no need to push it back because you might have cases where files need to be transformed in multiple different ways independent of each other. The trick with ES is it's more focused on business workflow and on tracking files and projects through a process. And because of that, ES workflow is sort of the inverse of this. All workflows are associated at their core with some sort of an object in ES. And that can be a project, for example, it could be a form. For sake of simplicity here, I'm going to focus on documents today, although this applies to any sort of ES object. But the workflows are focused, they're tethered to a specific object, rather than Twist, where you had the objects or files were associated with the process or the workflow. Here you have workflow instances, and those workflow instances generally are a little more linear than they had to be in Twist, because the idea is you're using this in some capacity for status, especially if you're dealing with approvals. So in a lot of cases, you've got situations where a workflow might branch off to handle a special condition. You might have cases where you need multiple approvals in tandem, but you generally have some need in most cases to merge those branches back into some kind of main line so that you can keep track of the status of the workflow overall. So just to give an example of the simplest sort of multi-branch workflow you can build in ES, here's a very simple workflow I built. Files come in, they're marked as material received. We go to a preview generation step, and then we fork in two different directions. So we've got a prepress approval here, and we've got an art approval here. If I were to upload a file so that it runs through this workflow, then we'll see that the file passed through both of these branches. It's waiting at both of these approval steps simultaneously. So I can go ahead and approve one of these, for example, and we can see this one's still waiting for our other approver down here. So that's as simple as it gets, but usually in a case like this, you wouldn't want to have just two separate approvals that are kind of hanging out on their own. You might want to wait until certain conditions are met to decide, for example, to send files to a certain branch of the workflow. And that's where program links and conditions come into play here. So when you develop one of these workflows, you have the ability to click on any of these links and build a condition for it. You could do that the old school way, for example, was to do it, for example, JavaScript. I have a, let me pull up, I have actually a job ticket here that's kind of relevant to this. So I have two checkboxes, two booleans on here, and I've got an option for print location. So I could say maybe in some of the most simple case, I want for my art approval, I'm only doing that if I'm printing in LA. So I could have a var my print location equals context.get metadata job, because we're grabbing this metadata from the job level. The metadata is called print location. And then actually got to put in the metadata set here too, my bad, will be webinar. So we're grabbing this piece of metadata and pulling it into a JavaScript variable here. Then after that, what we can do is if print location dot equals true, return true. And so what this is doing is it's checking to see whether this value is, or actually my print location will be LA. Forgive me here, I changed this example right before I started the webinar. So if my print location is equal to LA, then follow this branch. So the true would tell it to follow that link, false would tell it to ignore that link or cancel it. Typically you want to put some kind of a condition after that, like I'll do false here. So that would say if it doesn't match this condition, then just continue on. What I'm going to be showing you in a minute is the new ES5.5 condition editor. If you're running ES5.5 or newer, then typically that's what you're going to want to use for most cases. There are two specific cases where for these sort of conditions, you might want to go back to this old school method. And the first is if you needed to do something a little more complex than a simple if-else sort of setup like we have here. Like, for example, you might have a case where you need to validate some kind of PO number or something to make sure that it fits a proper format that you're expecting. You can use this to perform more complex JavaScript commands for that. The second case where this would be useful is if you have a particularly complex junction in your workflow where you want a little more background or a little more control over what happens during the evaluation process. What would be useful there is you have the ability to set variables throughout this process. So maybe if I want to check and see what was happening, maybe I'm doing a little more manipulation with this variable in some cases, a little more than I am here right now. I could always add in something like context dot set variable, and maybe I'll name it link 1. And I'll add in my print location here. And I'll put a second one in here. If condition met, true. And what this would do is variables are set so that they only exist for that specific run of a workflow. So if you reprocess the workflow, unlike metadata, variables get reset back to nothing. That's useful for if I have a case where maybe I have a file that runs down this link and I don't understand why it made it here. I have the ability to add in those variables as kind of a debug to show me later on what this wound up looking like under the hood at the time it ran. So I could see that it matched this if condition, and I could also see what value I had in this variable at that time to see if that was what I was expecting or if maybe there was a typo or something in the code. That can help me drill down a little and find out after the fact why the file followed this link. And if I wanted to see those variables, actually, why not? Let's save this real quick and hope I didn't make any typos here. So let me actually make this, I'll save my print location as LA and I'll upload a second file. And it looks like I typed it correctly. So what I could do here is if I wanted to check that, if I go into the workflow view, and I hit show context and I go to this variables tab, there's a workflow variable. There's a variables workflow section here where it'll show me all the variables that were set during the most recent run of this workflow. So I can see that based off of that, I met this link condition. And I can also see what the print location value was at the time it ran, which makes this incredibly useful for figuring out why it went here and what the values were. That's useful where you might have a case where if you have like 6 or 7 different conditions, or you need to perform some manipulation on a string while you're evaluating that link, you have some way you can trace back what happens. You're not just baffled when something runs unexpectedly. So I tend to, when I do wind up using the old school editor like this, I will tend to put some of those into workflows I develop as a force of habit, so they're there if I need them later on. Now, if you want to do this the more modern way, you also have the ability to use in ES5.5 and newer the condition editor, as I mentioned. And the condition editor is basically a graphical way of doing this. It's a little like the set param from RE and Twist, if you've ever used that. When this pops up, it gives me the ability to define my conditions. I can add different multiple conditions or groups of conditions, and then control what sort of match is needed in order for it to follow this link. So in this case, to do the same sort of thing I was just doing, I could say that I want my webinar metadata, I want the print location at the project level to equal LA. And that gives me the ability to control this basically from the UI. And it's nice because I don't need to look up what these values are. This automatically populates in the values for whatever I choose. So if I switch to, for example, this other enumeration here, it gives me all my options automatically. So I don't have to go back to another screen in the administrative area and look those up. It's also useful too because you have the ability, for example, it changes with the metadata type that you're looking at. So if I change to look at the dates at a date piece of metadata, you can see it changes to a calendar, and I have the ability to check whether it's before or after a specific date. But now in a case like this, I'd also have to choose, for example, maybe what I want to do with other links in this workflow. So do I want to follow down, the way this is set up right now, it'll always follow this link to prepress approval, but it'll only go to this art approval if the print location's LA. but there might be cases where I want it to be an either or situation. So if I wanted to make this the simpler way, I could always manually specify and say that for my condition over here, if the print location is at the project level is Philly, and I could manually specify Chicago in here as well. In this case, it might make more sense to say it's not equal to LA. But this is one of those cases where you have to consider what the goal of your workflow is. Because if you wind up defining these really rigidly, you might run into a case where you're saying, I want anything that comes from LA to go down this branch. Anything that's coming from Philly goes down this branch. But maybe at the time I defined that, I didn't have Chicago set up in my dropdown. So a file comes in with that metadata set for Chicago. The workflow is going to end at preview generation right here because it doesn't match either of those conditions. So this is a scenario where you probably want to figure out what you want to happen in a case where there's something unexpected like that. You might want to define, for example, a default path. So maybe I know in this case that art approval is only in specific circumstances. So that's the one I want to force to only for files from LA. In that case, what I could do for this one is set it so that it's the link condition is if no other link matches. So that it'll always go down this path. Or it'll go down this path if it's LA. If it doesn't match this, it's automatically going to go this way. Using those, you can kind of build a default path through the workflow, but you do have to be careful because if I know that I only want things to go down this path if they came from LA, I could run into a trap where I set this up to say anything that's not from LA goes here, or I manually specify plants here, and have an if no other link matches down here. I could set it up kind of the flip way where I reverse how I set these up. But the problem with that would be is if no other link matches, if you have unexpected input, that is more likely to be the one that gets triggered. So that might be, I typically try to put those in cases where I would be more comfortable with a file unexpectedly going down that specific branch. You could also rigidly define both of these cases and then build a third branch for anything that doesn't match that maybe sends an email out to your workflow team to let them know. You can also have the ability, though, to make more complex conditions, as I was starting on here. So I could have it set up that, let me pop back in here and make this a condition. So we did single conditions. Maybe I want to do groups. So I could do my initial one here. We have the print location is LA again. And I could make a group within here, too. So I'll have a condition for so what this would mean is I'll set this up to here to or. I'll set this to Boolean equals true. So this would say on my job ticket is we have an or condition up here for match criteria for this thing as a whole. So I mean either the print location needs to be set to LA, or I need a print location of Chicago, and this checkbox set to true. I would need either this one thing for the print location or both a specific location and another piece of metadata in tandem. So you have basically for criteria, you have and, which means that all the criteria in here would have to match. You've got or, which mean if either or both of them match. Only one exclusive or, which means that both of these can't match, but if one of them matches, then it considers that condition valid. and then not, which is none of them can match. So, and you can drill those down pretty far if you need to. So you can build conditions within conditions within conditions, or groups within groups within groups, to really drill down if you have a complex scenario that way. But the one thing we're running into here is a lot of these examples, we're not really grouping back up like I was showing here. We've still got two separate branches that don't really fit together. What would we do if we had a situation where maybe once both these approvals were done, we wanted the workflow to merge back together and tell you that it was complete with a specific step? Instinct might say that you just put in another milestone like delivered and then link these up. But that's where we run into the problem of ES needs you to tell it with specific logic steps how and under what conditions it's supposed to merge back together. There are three main logic steps that are used for this. They're called AND, OR, and many. They show up under the logical area here. So as an example of an AND step, I have my two different approvals. This workflow has no conditions in it. So files come down both of these branches. And actually, why not? I'll just drop a file in so you can see it directly. So let me push a file in here. So I go ahead and approve this. What it's going to do is it's going to wait until both of the links that come into here, or all of the links that come into here, have been, all the branches in the workflow have hit this point. So it's still waiting. This one already passed this point. So it's still waiting on pre-press approval to get there before it'll continue to the final completed step. So if I'll go ahead and bypass for my other approver because he's not going to do it himself. And you'll see then it passes the end step and goes on to the end. What I could also do here is I could set up an OR. So that would mean that if either of these two links, if either of these two branches hits the OR step, then it would move to completed. I wouldn't need to wait for all of them. There's one third one, many, that can be used if you have a specific number. So you need 2 or you need like 6. You can actually specify the specific number of branches that need to be that need to hit that step before it continues on. So you could have a case where that would be a case where maybe you have 3 different approval cycles that are all in tandem like this. You know that if 2 of them hit that point, then you know that that's good enough. You could build something like that. Many steps don't tend to be used that frequently. They tend to be very specific, tailored circumstances, but they are there if you need them. As another example of an OR that might fit a little more with what you'd see in production if you don't want to ignore your approval, I have another variant of this workflow here. We'll dump a file in. Now what this workflow is going to do is I split this up. It's the same kind of workflow. We have a condition here where it's checking to see if a certain value is true before it goes to the art approval. But the way I have this one set up here is the OR is set up. I have an if no other link matches here. So if my print location is LA, for example, it's going to come down here to the art approval. If it's not the art approval, it's going to follow the if no other link matches, but it's going to hit the OR here. So that means that we need either a completed art approval, or in the case where the art approval is not needed, it just continues on to pre-press approval. So for if you have an art approval, it'll wait for the art approval. If you don't have an art approval cycle based on the condition, it'll just continue directly to pre-press approval. Now there's one other quirk of how I set this up in here. You'll notice that there is a node in here. And the reason that there's a node in here, let me actually set my metadata so we get an art approval this time around. So what you'll see here is with that condition, we can see that this step was completed and we passed on to the art approval. This node here that I have in here is listed as canceled. And that's because when you have a link evaluation, you've got multiple links in here, the links that aren't followed, or if the link condition shows as false, then it marks that step directly after it is canceled. So one of the problems we've run into a lot with customers who are new to this, because it's not expected behavior really, is if you create a condition like this and you link the OR directly after your if no other link matches, then what will wind up happening is here, the OR step will get canceled. And then if you had a workflow that went down this path of the art review, then as soon as it passes up to the OR, it's going to stop at this art approved because the OR step has been canceled. It would have been canceled, so it wouldn't follow it. So we typically wind up sticking in here what we call a buffer node in here to take that cancellation. It's a bit of a quirk of how Dalim implemented this. But if you want that entire branch, that OR to not get, or that end to not get canceled after condition, then you need to stick some kind of a buffer node in there just to make sure that it's still going to be active when your other branch gets to it. So that's typically something where you generally, though, if you have a case for status, well, I can't speak. Typically, if you have a case like this where you want some master status afterwards, you need to, where you have like the delivered here, you need to merge any of those divergent branches back into the main branch of the workflow. There are a few exceptions. One of the exceptions that comes to mind for me right now is if you had, for example, an approval step that gets rejected, I might add in a waiting for correction milestone. And I could set that to on error. So if this art approval gets rejected, it's going to move down to waiting for correction. That would be a case where I don't want to move that, I don't want to merge that back into the full workflow as a whole, because I know that that's basically an end state for that specific run of the workflow. This case is just because you have to, this would be if you needed to merge those back together so you can get to a final status. This would be the final status here, so there wouldn't really be a merge needed. But one other case where I could see you needing a merge here would be there is maybe you have a case where someone rejects a file and you don't want it to fail out of the workflow. You have the ability to add in a, for example, a clear whiffle error step. See where this is hiding on me. Here we go. Let me stick that in here. So I could have a case where maybe I want to, when a file gets rejected, I want it to continue on in the workflow under specific circumstances, but I don't want it to fail out. Another example of how this could work is, let me get my OR node in here, and let me get my buffer node. I can have it set so that this art approval goes to a clear whiffle error step with the on error condition. I add a OR step in here. We'll just continue on in here. Actually, I don't need the, the node would go here. And then that could continue on as normal. So that's about the basics for logic. There was one other thing I wanted to show today before we move on to troubleshooting, and that is, because I think we're running a little low on time, and that is moving backwards. Because one of the big tells from all these logic steps is ES workflow is much more linear as a requirement than twist workflow. So if you're running into a case where maybe with Maybe I had a workflow where I have a preview generation, I have a milestone approval here, I have an approve step. Maybe there's a certain case where I need to move the file back to preview generation or back to this approval again. In Twist, what you typically do is you just wind up linking it back together and building a loop. So something will go back along a specific path. But that doesn't tend to work in ES because ES marks these steps as completed once they're done. So if you link a step back, it's just going to stop when it gets here. But so the trick here is you have to use a step called call whiffle. And this is typically used if you need to branch to another separate workflow. So you might have a file, if it reaches a certain point in one of your workflows, you know you need to send it to a second workflow for additional approvals, or a second workflow that sends out an email or does something else. That's typically what call whiffle is used for. It's sort of like the branch option in Twist, where you could branch to another workflow. What I've done here is I set this up so that it returns the workflow name of the current workflow as the workflow that it's going to run, and I have the preview generation step here listed as the step it's going to run to. So if I go to project here, I'll drop a file in. And actually it's running the wrong workflow. Here we go. Try the right workflow real quick. Okay, so our file came in. It's held at my approval. And you'll see as soon as it I approve it, it goes back to preview generation and regenerates a preview, and now I'm back where I was. And you can probably see it if I sneak in the workflow real quick. You can see it bounce back to that step. And now it's back at my approval milestone once again. The one thing you do have to be very careful for, it's a little dangerous as I showed it in this exact example. I have my approval milestone set up so it always needs an approval. So even if I don't have anyone with my approval role assigned for this milestone, it's still going to pause here. One of the problems we run into a lot with this sort of time warp is if you don't have some kind of break point in here, some point where it's pausing, and you have a case where you could keep looping back infinitely over and over to the same step, they can wind up breaking or basically bringing your ES to a halt because it'll basically just overrun the task queue. So there are to be cases where there's a condition where it's not always going to run that loop continually, or you have some sort of a break like an approval step. You need one of those two things in here to make sure that you don't wind up breaking your system down. So be very careful with this. If you're thinking about doing any sort of looping like this and you haven't played with it before, please feel free to open a help desk ticket. We can check it to make sure you're not going to bring the system down, because it's really easy to do. I've done it myself by mistake, so I will advise caution there. One other case where this runs into where we wind up using this call whiffle sort of setup is we have a few customers who have special workflows where they might have a special condition that's used once in a blue moon, and it's used very rarely, but they need, when certain circumstances require, they need to send it to some special step that's unrelated to anything else. So I think I have here maybe we'll use this milestone. That's exciting enough. If you had a step you wanted to call to, like this milestone over here, you can't quite get away with just leaving it unhooked, because that's another quirk of ES, is it expects that all the steps in the workflow need to be hooked up to something. Otherwise, it's going to try starting both these when the workflow gets a file in. So what you need to do in a case like this, and it is kind of silly, is put I should put a node in here. I think in some cases you do need a node. I tend to put one just for safety's sake. And yeah, you need one because this is going to cancel the node. We're going to put a condition in here that's just return false. So when the workflow starts, it's always going to go to preview generation, and it's always going to return false in this link and cancel the node.
You really don't even need that link down to the node. It could start at node, and then you could double click node, or sorry, get the conditions on node. I think this will, yeah. And the button that says cancel action, no, click on the node itself. Cancel action will keep it from starting on that node. Just another way to do what you're basically doing by doing the false.
That's another good point.
Yeah, because any tool that's loose in a workflow will start, it would start another process of the file at that tool. This keeps it from doing it, and it could just be a floating node to whatever else you're looking for.
Yeah, that's a good point. But you did do either of those, have either the cancel action with your node, or you need some kind of a return false link that's never going to be followed. Otherwise, it's automatically going to run with the workflow. But this is how, if you have a special status that's only called in blue moon, like once in a blue moon, how you sneak it into the workflow and how you could reference it from a call whiffle. This is usually in a case where you might need to call that status from any of a dozen places in a workflow, or even if you need to call it from an unrelated user action, this would also work in that case. But the last thing I think I'll talk about for today is, because we're running really low on time here, is how to handle. I showed how to do it with the program links, where you could basically save variables to show you what happened as a file went through a workflow. But what if you want to grab all the info and you don't want to do it this yourself manually? Or if you have a case where maybe you're using the condition editor and you don't want to mess around with JavaScript at all, you have the ability to use a tool called dump context. And I'll dump a file in this workflow, and then we'll take a look at what this does. So our file came into this workflow. I have a link here that sets a piece of metadata. So we're setting the important text metadata, it's just original value. We have a approval milestone, a dump context step, and then another program link that sets the important text metadata to new value. So what'll happen is if I go ahead and let me approve this step, if I go down here and I click on any of these steps and do show context, and I go to page order, webinar, you'll see my important text is set to new value. I think it's actually set that way for earlier links too. Yeah, it's whenever you click on any step other than dump context, it's going to give you whatever the current values for all metadata associated with this file. So it's always going to show you what the newest value is, which if you run into a case where you've got a complex condition, you're trying to figure out what metadata you had in place at the time it ran. If you dump a dump context step after that in the workflow, like right after the link for anything else happens, and you do or right before for that matter too, if I do a look at this, you'll see this has the original value for that metadata instead of the new value. So you can use those to save the state, sort of like you would with the show memories in Twist, to basically make a record of what everything was set to at that specific point in the workflow. Because I know that can be a pain if you run into a case where you have a crazy condition, you got 5 or 6 different possible outcomes, and you don't understand why it's going down a certain path. This is one way you can try to find out. But that's pretty much everything I have for today. Do we have any questions?
Just a couple, well, one complex. We'll see. You did get a general hi, Alex, from someone.
I saw that.
And someone asking, could you, for the group again, I think some of y'all have been on, we've explained this before, but just what the difference between the move to from JavaScript to Java means, and is there some kind of interpreter for existing routines they might have to interpret or make it easy for them to move to the Java?
Yep. Well, as far as Java goes, in ES5.5, Dalim removed the old school Java interpreter as an option in these links. So if I go to the workflow editor on here, and I go to make a condition in one of these workflows, I have the option for JavaScript. In older versions, you could choose between Java, JavaScript, and Tickle. Tickle and Java support have been deprecated, so in the newer version of ES, for new links, you have to use JavaScript. But if you have old Java conditions in your workflow, they will work fine as long as you have them in place. It'll keep them in there. You can still edit them. It'll still run them with Java. You just can't make new Java links. As far as migration to JavaScript for some of those old links, I would say submit a help desk ticket, and we can help you out with that. It's for basic operations, it's not too different. But if you're doing anything particularly complex with like string manipulation, or you have any Java libraries you've imported, or anything particularly complex, that's a case where we probably need to help you out with it. Other than that, the syntax isn't too different. And if you're desperate, one cheat I have seen people do is if they have a Java link in here somewhere, they'll copy the condition and they'll paste it in elsewhere, and then they can edit and open the Java link as if it were a new one. But the reason Dalim removed that was because there were some changes. There was basically the Java interpreter they used was deprecated a while ago. It hasn't been updated since 2003, and that was a bit of a security risk. So that's why they're moving everyone to JavaScript.
Perfect, thanks. And then the only other one is, could you explain scenarios where you should use the clear workflow approval, or clear keep approval, whatever it's called?
Yeah, clear keep approval.
Keep approval.
Those would be cases where you have some sort of error in the workflow that you want to mitigate. It's sort of like an error node was in Twist, or one of those on error links in Twist. The idea is that the file will still show an indicator that there was an error, but it'll allow it to continue on in the workflow so you can have it land a little more gracefully. We have also seen cases, for example, where customers wanted someone to have the ability to reject files at certain approval steps, but not have it fill out of the workflow.
Okay, and I think that's all we have.
Easy enough. Well, thank you everyone for attending. I hope to see you at Duo in April. Have a good one.